Every Tuesday morning, a 71-year-old widow named Dorothy Hensley pushed a rusted garden cart through the back alleys of Cedar Ridge, Ohio, collecting broken wooden pallets from behind the hardware store. The neighbors filmed her. The local Facebook group nicknamed her the Pallet Lady. For 2 full years, an entire town treated Dorothy like a punchline. What nobody knew was that behind the tall cedar fence in her backyard, Dorothy was building something with those pallets. And on the morning that fence finally came down, the same people who laughed at her stood in the street and wept. If you had asked anyone in Cedar Ridge about Dorothy Hensley back in 2019, they would have told you she was the quiet woman in the gray farmhouse at the end of Maple Street. The one who kept her porch light on all night, every night, for reasons nobody bothered to ask about. They had no idea who they were living next to. Dorothy had spent 46 years married to a carpenter named Walter Hensley. Walter built half the porches in Cedar Ridge. He built the pews in the Methodist church, the bleachers at the Little League field, and the oak counter at Miller's Diner that people still rest their elbows on today. Their garage was his workshop, a small wooden building filled with hand planes, chisels, sawdust, and the smell of pine. Dorothy spent thousands of evenings out there with him, handing him tools, holding boards steady, learning without ever realizing she was learning. They had one son, Michael. He played catcher for the Cedar Ridge Wildcats, joined the Army at 19, and served 2 tours overseas. When he came home, something in him had gone quiet. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't hold a job. He drifted west, first to Columbus, then Indianapolis, then places he stopped mentioning in his phone calls. The calls got shorter. Then they stopped. In March of 2018, 2 officers knocked on Dorothy's door. Michael had been found in a tent encampment under a highway overpass in Indianapolis, 300 miles from the bedroom that still had his baseball trophies on the shelf. He was 41 years old. He had frozen to death in the last cold snap of winter, less than a mile from a shelter that had run out of beds. Dorothy buried her son on a Tuesday. Walter's heart gave out 11 months later. The doctors called it cardiac failure. Dorothy called it what it was. He died of grief at his workbench, with a half-finished birdhouse still clamped in the vise. So when the people of Cedar Ridge saw an old woman in a wool coat dragging splintered pallets down an alley, they saw someone who had lost the plot. What they were actually looking at was a woman who had lost everything else and had one thing left to do. It started on a cold morning in October of 2019. Dorothy was walking past the loading dock behind Hartman's Hardware when she saw a stack of broken shipping pallets leaning against the dumpster, waiting for the landfill truck. She stood there for a long time, looking at the rough pine slats. Then she went home, pulled Walter's old garden cart out of the shed, and came back for them. The manager at Hartman's, a man named Doug Pearson, thought she wanted firewood. He told her to take as many as she liked. He would later admit he laughed about it in the break room. The old lady and her junk wood. Everyone laughed about it in the beginning. Because Dorothy didn't stop at Hartman's, she showed up behind the grocery store, the auto parts shop, the feed store out on County Road 12. Week after week, in rain and frost, this small gray-haired woman loaded pallet after pallet onto a cart with a squeaking wheel and hauled them nearly a mile back to Maple Street. Store clerks watched her through the windows. Drivers slowed down to stare. And then the internet got involved. Someone posted a photo of Dorothy in the Cedar Ridge community Facebook group. She was mid-pull, hunched against the wind, the cart stacked high with scrap wood. The caption read, "Anyone know why the pallet lady is hoarding half the town's garbage?" The comments were worse. People joked that she was building an ark. Someone said her property was going to end up on one of those hoarder shows. A woman named Diane Dietz, who lived 4 houses down from Dorothy, wrote that the neighborhood had standards and that somebody ought to report her. Somebody did, twice. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. Dorothy never responded to any of it. Not one comment, not one confrontation. Because in November of 2019, She had done something nobody noticed. She had hired a contractor from 2 towns over to build a 6-foot cedar privacy fence around her entire backyard. To the neighbors, the fence was proof she had something to hide. To Dorothy, it was just a way to work in peace. Behind that fence, in Walter's old workshop, Dorothy opened her husband's tool chest for the first time since his funeral. His hand planes were still sharp, his pencils were still in the coffee can, and on the shelf above the workbench sat a row of spiral notebooks, decades of Walter's sketches, measurements, and framing notes written in the careful block letters of a man who measured twice for a living. Dorothy was 71 years old. She had arthritis in both hands and a hip that ached when the weather turned. She had never framed a wall in her life, but she had spent 46 years watching the best carpenter in the county do it, and she had his notebooks, and she had a plan drawn on the back of a church bulletin. She was going to build a house, a small one, a warm one, the kind of place her son needed on the night he died and couldn't find. The first winter nearly broke her. Pallet wood is brutal material. Every board has to be pried apart with a crowbar, and every board fights back. The nails bend, the slats split. Dorothy learned to soak the joints, to work the bar slowly, to save the hardwood stringers for framing and the pine slats for sheathing. Her hands blistered, then bled, then hardened. Some nights she could only work for an hour before her fingers stopped cooperating. She worked that hour anyway. She also got smarter than anyone gave her credit for. Dorothy figured out that grocery store pallets were usually softwood, light and easy to haul but weak, while the pallets behind the auto parts shop were often oak, heavy as sin but strong enough to frame with. She started leaving thank you notes for the store managers, and the store managers, half amused and half charmed, started setting the good ones aside for her. Doug Pearson at Hartman's caught himself checking the loading dock on Tuesday mornings to make sure her stack was ready, even while he was still telling the pallet lady jokes inside. By spring of 2020, she had a foundation of concrete deck blocks and a floor frame built from more than 60 dismantled pallets, sitting level and square in the corner of her yard. She checked it with Walter's old spirit level, the brass one he bought in 1974. The bubble sat dead center. Dorothy sat down on the fresh deck and cried for the first time since the funeral. The town, meanwhile, kept laughing, and this is where the story stopped going the way anyone expected. In June of 2020, 3 high school boys hopped a neighbor's fence on a dare to film whatever the crazy pallet lady was hiding. One of them, a 16-year-old named Tyler Brandt, got his phone over the top of the cedar boards and recorded 11 seconds of video before Dorothy's porch light flicked on, and they ran. That night, Tyler watched the clip and got confused. There was no junk pile or hoarder's maze. There was a neat lumber rack, a stack of clean, de-nailed boards sorted by size, and the skeleton of a small building with perfect corners rising in the moonlight. Tyler never posted the video. Something about it didn't feel funny anymore, but he didn't tell anyone what he'd seen either, and so the mockery rolled on without him. Diane Dietz escalated. In August, she filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming Dorothy was running an unpermitted construction operation and a fire hazard. A code enforcement officer named Dan Kowalski drove out to Maple Street with a clipboard and every expectation of shutting the whole thing down. He knocked. Dorothy opened the gate and let him in without a word of argument. Dan stood in that backyard for a long moment with his clipboard hanging at his side. In front of him was a 14-foot by 20-foot cabin, framed and sheathed, with a steep little roof and a covered porch. The framing was old school, 16 inches on center, blocked and braced like something out of a textbook. On the workbench were Walter's notebooks, a stack of library books on residential wiring, and a folder where Dorothy had kept every receipt, every sketch, and a set of hand-drawn plans. He asked her what it was going to be. Dorothy told him the truth for the first time out loud. It was going to be a home for a homeless veteran, one person, free for as long as they needed it, because 2 winters ago, her boy died outside in the cold, and she was never going to be able to fix that. But she could fix this. Dan Kowalski had served in the army himself. He stood in that sawdust-smelling yard, looked at the plans, and made a decision that probably bent a few rules. Instead of a violation notice, he wrote out a list of exactly what she would need to make it legal. Then he started showing up on Saturdays, off the clock, in his own work boots. He never said much about it. He just told his wife he was helping a friend with a project. If you're finding yourself invested in Dorothy's story, take 1 second and hit subscribe, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel is about. Now, back to Cedar Ridge. By the spring of 2021, the cabin had a metal roof, salvaged windows from a barn demolition in the next county, and insulation Dorothy paid for out of Walter's life insurance. The pallet count had passed 300. Dorothy had personally pulled somewhere north of 9,000 nails, and she kept them all in coffee cans because Walter never threw away a straight nail in his life. She still hauled her cart through the alleys every Tuesday. People still filmed her. The pallet lady jokes still circulated at Miller's Diner, at the gas station, in the comment sections. One local page even ran a poll asking what she was building back there. The top answer, with over 200 votes, was a joke about a doomsday bunker. Dorothy saw it. She turned off her computer and went back to sanding trim. Then came the night of June 14th, 2021, and the storm that nearly ended everything. A derecho tore across northern Ohio that night with winds near 80 miles an hour. It peeled shingles off half of Cedar Ridge, dropped a maple limb through Diane Deitz's sunroom, and slammed into Dorothy's backyard in the dark. She stood at her kitchen window in the lightning flashes, watching the fence panels bow and the tarps rip away, unable to do anything but wait. At dawn, she walked out to survey the damage. A section of the cedar fence was flattened. Her lumber rack was scattered across 3 yards. The porch overhang she had spent a month building had been torn loose and thrown against the workshop wall, cracked down the middle. But the cabin stood, square, plumb, and dry inside. Walter's framing had held. The flattened fence changed everything, though, because for the first time in 2 years, the whole street could see into Dorothy's yard. And what they saw did not match a single joke they had told. Diane Deitz saw it first, standing in her bathrobe amid her own storm debris. A tidy little house with white-trimmed windows, a hand-built porch swing, and a small carved sign leaning against the steps, not yet hung. She walked closer, close enough to read it. The sign said, "Michael's Place," and underneath, in smaller letters, it said, "No one sleeps in the cold." Diane stood in the wet grass for a long time. Then she went home, sat down at the same computer she had used to report Dorothy to the county, and typed Michael Hensley Cedar Ridge into a search bar. She found the obituary from 2018. She found the words "died in Indianapolis." She found a 9-year-old newspaper photo of a grinning kid in a Wildcats uniform, and she recognized the front porch in the background because it was 4 houses down from her own. The post Diane wrote that afternoon is still pinned in the Cedar Ridge community group today. In it, she admitted to the complaints, the comments, and the nickname. She explained what the pallet lady had actually been doing behind that fence for 2 years and who she was doing it for. Her last line asked a simple question. She wanted to know who would show up Saturday morning to help rebuild the fence of the best person in this town. 240 people showed up. They came with trucks, tool belts, casseroles, and lumber. Doug Pearson from Hartman's Hardware arrived with a trailer of donated materials and an apology he had clearly rehearsed in the mirror. Tyler Brandt came with the 2 friends who had hopped the fence with him, and this time they asked permission first. An electrician offered to finish the wiring for free. A plumber roughed in the bathroom over a single weekend. Dan Kowalski walked the inspections through the county office personally. Dorothy, by every account, spent that first Saturday quietly telling people where Walter would have wanted things and making sure everyone got fed. Somebody asked her, late in the afternoon, why she never once defended herself in those 2 years of jokes and complaints. Dorothy just shrugged and said arguing would have taken time. And she didn't have time, because somewhere out there, Somebody's child was sleeping in the cold. On November 11th, 2021, Veterans Day, Michael's Place welcomed its first resident. His name was Raymond Okafor, a 58-year-old Army veteran who had been living in his Buick in a Walmart parking lot outside Toledo for the better part of a year. A regional veterans outreach group had connected him with Dorothy. When Ray stepped through the door, he found the heat already running, a quilt Dorothy had sewn folded on the bed, a full pantry, and a note on the kitchen table that read, "This house was built by a mother. Stay as long as you need." Ray later told a local reporter that he read the note 4 times, then sat down on the floor of a warm house and cried like a kid. Ray stayed 14 months. He got steady work at the feed store, the same feed store Dorothy used to collect pallets behind, and he saved enough to rent his own apartment in town. On the day he moved out, he handed the keys to the next veteran on the list, a woman named Denise who had been sleeping in a shelter in Akron with her dog. Then Ray joined the build crew. Because there was a build crew now, and there was a list. The town that spent 2 years laughing at Dorothy Hensley couldn't stop building. A retired farmer donated the use of a half-acre lot behind the Methodist church, the church with Walter's pews in it. The Pallet Project, as everyone started calling it, put up a second cabin in the spring of 2022, and a third that fall. Local businesses that once let their employees mock the old woman at their loading docks now stacked their pallets neatly by the curb every Monday night with her name spray-painted on the top board. The high school shop class adopted the project. Tyler Brandt, the kid with the phone over the fence, led the student crew during his senior year, and he'll tell anyone who asks that Dorothy taught him more with a crowbar and a coffee can of nails than any classroom ever did. He's an apprentice carpenter now. As of this year, 7 tiny homes stand behind the church in Cedar Ridge, every one of them framed with reclaimed pallet lumber, and every one of them named. Michael's Place, Walter's Corner. The rest carry the names of veterans from Cedar Ridge who never made it home, chosen by their families. 19 formerly homeless veterans have lived in them so far. 11 have moved on to permanent housing and handed their keys to the next name on the list, the way Ray did. Nobody has ever paid a dime of rent. Dorothy is 78 now. Her hip finally forced her to give up the garden cart, so the alley runs belong to volunteers these days. But every Tuesday morning, weather permitting, she still walks the row of little houses with her thermos, checks the porches, and sits for a while on the swing outside Michael's Place. The porch light there stays on all night, every night, just like hers always did. It turns out that light was never a quirk. It was for Michael, so that if her boy ever found his way home in the dark, he would know somebody was waiting up. He never got the chance. So Dorothy built a porch light that waits up for everyone else's sons and daughters instead. The people of Cedar Ridge laughed at an old woman pulling garbage through the alleys because from the outside, that's all they could see. Grief doesn't always look like flowers and photographs. Sometimes it looks like a 71-year-old widow with a crowbar, prying apart the world's discarded things and refusing to let anything or anyone stay broken. If this story moved you, do one thing before you go. Watch the video on your screen right now about a retired janitor who spent 25 years secretly paying off school lunch debts because Dorothy isn't the only quiet hero hiding in a small town.